PAC Con 2020. This is a session on hazing prevention, and we're going to kick things off with a land acknowledgement. So I am sharing my screen now, which will have the text of our land acknowledgement up and viewable for all of you visual learners out there, so you can follow along. We, as Platt House, the PAC Shop, and PAC-Exec, want to begin with a voicing of gratitude to the past and present generations of Indigenous people for the opportunity to live our lives in this space. Although we're gathering on the internet, many of us are living and learning on Lenape-Hoking. We currently call this space Philadelphia, but this land was stolen from the Lenni Lenape tribe, the original stewards of this land. If you don't know the name and story of the people whose land you occupy, you can find that information and many other great resources at native-land.ca. We'll post that link in the chat. We also want to encourage you to please use the chat to drop your name and the group you're representing today. So if you can just go ahead and take a quick second to do that. In the meantime, I will turn things over to Laurie McCall.
Hey everyone, thank you for joining us on Sunday. It's final day of PAC Con. You've been doing a wonderful job of attending. Today's session is, we call it Anti-Hazing because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to mitigate hazing on campus, and a lot of people think of it as a Greek organization problem, and it is not. And I think a lot of you are aware of some of that problem happening in performing arts. And Katie is the executive director of the Office of Student Affairs. She is well versed in hazing. We've been following all the new laws that have happened due to horrible hazing incidences on other campuses. And there's a whole task force that she's in charge, or committee that she's in charge of, and she is going to go through, you know, the definition, the problems, the prevention issues, and she's a very engaging speaker, so I'm going to turn it over to her.
Thanks, Lori and Megan, and thank you all for being here. I feel like I want to set myself up to not be successful, and I want to be transparent that you are viewing me in like the 4th location I've tried to jump on this thing today. So if I go missing on you at any point or go quiet, I will be back. I have other ways of connecting in, and I'm about 6 feet away from my twin boys. They could pop out at any moment. So maybe you'll get a quick a visit from them. So Megan, if you don't mind putting it, go ahead and toss the presentation up on the title slide. Sorry, this is that's about halfway through. There you go, cool. Okay, so today we're talking about interrupting hazing culture at Penn, right? And the reason that we say that is, look, our goal, we would love to see hazing be gone, eradicated, and not a thing. And that's not really where our community is right now, right? We have a lot of engagement to do as far as really being able to identify what hazing is and then also want to change it, right? And so today what I'm hoping we do together is learn a little bit more about what hazing is, help you build some tools and skills in identifying it, possibly broadening your understanding and definition of what you think hazing is, and then thinking about how you, whether it's you in your lane or your group, can help to interrupt that culture, right? Like start to question it, start to identify things and say, this might not be as supportive as we thought it was at one point, right? Or this could pose a problem. Obviously our goal is that we would hope to see then things change, right? But we realize that it's incremental. So the first thing we're working on here is just naming what it is and helping people define what it is and help you start putting that lens on activities and things that your group may engage in. And the final disclaimer I'll say is I realize we're engaging in this around your roles in performing arts groups, and certainly there will be things to take back to the performing arts community. And this is information that is valuable for any group you're in on campus, right? So as we go through this, you may start to think about examples from different experiences you've had, either high school or on campus. And that's fine too, right? I'm not going to ask you to speak about specific things, but I think getting those things in your mind's eye is fine, right? So don't discredit it if it doesn't have to do with this group. You may feel like it aligns itself with another group. So we can go to the next one, Megan. I think it's just my contact info, which not all that exciting. That's me. That's my email address. I know that Lori and Megan can also connect with me later if at the end of this or following this you want to talk more or just want to explore a little bit more about any of the topics or talk about things within your group that we might education wise or whatever, like I'm available to do that and happy to do that. And we have a whole team of folks, as Lori said, in our anti-hazing working group that could be available, you know, in the appropriate way to connect. So we'll go to the next one. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to use the chat feature here. I'm not going to ask you to talk out loud yet. But I'd love people to, for this first question, what are the traditions or hallmarks or key elements of your new member welcome process, whatever you call that? So some groups will call that initiation. Sometimes that's, you know, like whatever, new member week, like whatever you want to call that. What are some of the kinds of things that are just like, gosh, we do this every year. This is a way that we welcome our new members or something we do to indoctrinate our new members. Go ahead and just drop some of those things in the chat. You don't have to attribute it to your group, but just like some of those activities. Auditions, social events early in the semester. And I will wait because there definitely has to be more. There we go. Singing our alumni song. Okay, scavenger hunt, the dance party, food, very low key. A first rehearsal and making an event out of it. Okay. Anyone else have anything else they do? First, introducing sections with small events. Okay. Scavenger hunt, newbie party. Skit or performance. We said, okay, great. Icebreakers, the first rehearsal. Okay, so auditions, part of the new welcome event. Okay, so that's the thing we do, right? And that's a lot of us get stuck in the, well, we do this every year. It's a thing I did. We have to do the thing, right? So what I'd like to ask you to do now is sort of step back and say, what are the results that you're looking for in your new members as a result of participating in these things, if that makes sense, right? So because they did the newbie party or the icebreakers at the first rehearsal, right? Like what impact are you hoping that will have? What outcome do you want to have with people participating in these things? And you can drop that in the chat too. Bonding with the existing group, a sense of community, group bonding, social incorporation into the group, creating memories, stay involved in the group, good memories, bonding with the group, great. Right, so that's, you know, a lot of these enthusiastic retention, that there we go, right? So a lot of this comes up, right? We want people to have a sense of, right, joy and connection to other people, feel like they're a part of the community. It makes them want to stay engaged in the community, right? I mean, stay engaged in the group, right? Those are the things we're looking to do, right? And we bring that up because obviously sometimes hazing activities can fall into this bit of a gray space, right? Of, well, it was bonding and it was fun, right? And it might get you this output. But what we want to ask about is it the most constructive and healthy and supportive way, right, to get to that outcome? Or are there other ways to keep that outcome in mind and then think about the activities we do, right? We can go to the next slide. Megan. Thanks. So I'm wondering if people, and I'm going to ask maybe for a couple of brave volunteers, people can also drop things in the chat, but I'd love if one or two folks would sort of share, when someone says the word hazing, like what does that mean to you? What images does that conjure up for you? You can put it in the chat, and or I'd love one or two people to unmute and offer something verbally.
I'll say something, Katie. I think it's when when there's an unwanted pressure on a new member to participate in something that they may not want to or would not have done with their own, through their own volition. Okay.
Yeah. So this idea of like a peer pressure, right? Or just sort of being forced, the sense of feeling forced or yeah, pressured to do something. That's great. Anyone else think of like what else does hazing bring up for you? mental or physical abusing or harassing. Yeah, Jaden, I see your hand.
Yeah, I think what comes to mind to me, just a couple words, is both humiliation and intimidation.
Okay.
What comes to mind for me is like older members like putting on a front, like almost like changing their personality to seem more intimidating during this initiation process or whatever you want to call it, in order to like create a different vibe in the group. And on the other hand, like the humiliation element is like it's bonding with your so-called new friends when really it may not be warranted. And some people may say like, oh, it's not a big deal. Like it's for fun, like, you know, like have like, but like it is a big deal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so part of what I'm hearing in that is sort of the sense of like a power dynamic, right? Like there are definitely people who, right, like they put on that, yeah, we're the tough and intimidating older members, right? And trying to sort of remind people of their place in the structure, right? Like we definitely see that power imbalances are a big part of hazing. These are great, yeah. And then Kelsey's, you know, addition here of the mental or physically abusing or harassing members of the group. So all of these are elements of hazing for sure. We can advance to the next one, Megan. So the definition we have here is from hazingprevention.org, right? It says, oh, whoops, I made your chat really giant, everybody. Hazing is any action taken or any situation created intentionally that causes embarrassment, harassment, or ridicule and risks emotional and or physical harm to members of a group or team, whether new or not, regardless of the person's willingness to participate. So I think that these are sort of interesting, right? Because a lot of times we think about hazing is really for new people in our groups, right? But really this is highlighting this idea of new or not. If it is relegated to one specific group of people, right, that are sort of pulled out and made to do something special that may be problematic, right, that can be considered hazing. And this idea of regardless of a person's willingness to participate. We see a lot of time when concerns around hazing come through conduct or through our office, right, this idea of like, but we gave people a choice, right? And I think the thing is that at the stage of life that you all are in, right, and the idea of peer pressure and how influential that can be, it's really hard to determine if a person is really willingly doing something versus feeling like they needed to do it, right, to maintain their role in an organization. So just keep those little bits in mind as we move forward. We can go to the next one, Megan. I think one of the things to just sort of set the context for where we are in the state of Pennsylvania and therefore the laws that govern the university. Some of you may be more or less familiar with the case with Timothy Piazza. He was a young man who died from a hazing incident at Penn State in 2017. And as a result, in January 2019, the hazing laws in Pennsylvania were updated. So now hazing is punishable as a felony. Like that's a pretty significant charge. The other major piece that I think really relates to groups on campus is that it makes a reporting requirement for universities. So if a group is found responsible for hazing, and at Penn we interpret that to mean that they had a case through student conduct and they were found responsible through our judicial process. That then that group is included in a report that we have to make available online for the course of 5 years, right? So if you were to visit Student Conduct's website, you would see that there's actually a report available there. It does not, all of the data is like, it has the name of the group, but you would never be able to know like who the people were, right? It doesn't say that like Katie Bonner did this or even like the president did this, right? Like if I were the president, right? To be able to figure out who I was backtracking. But the idea of it is that, you know, we have a lot of new students that come to our communities every year who don't really have any context or knowledge of our groups, right, beyond what current people tell them. And so the thought is that it's important for people to know if a group was found responsible for this sort of activity, almost like a buyer beware program, right, sort of making you aware of the things you need to know. And you may still choose, right, maybe the group has gone through a lot of education and they've really shifted and changed, and you know, a couple of years later you wouldn't even recognize some of those activities. But just so you know, this is a thing. It does, it does end up on this public report that is viewable by others. All right, and then we had to update, obviously, our anti-hazing policy as a result of the laws being updated. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm wondering if I can get a volunteer to read the Penn policy, which is slightly different than the definition we just read. Can anyone hop on and do that for me? You're gonna get tired of my voice quickly. And maybe not Jaden or Adriana since they already spoke.
Just read that.
Yeah, go ahead. Thank you, Sadie.
Cool. Okay, definition. For purposes of these regulations and consistent with the anti-hazing law of Pennsylvania, hazing means any action or situation, one, which recklessly or intentionally endangers the mental or physical health or safety of a student, or two, which willfully destroys or removes public or private property for the purpose of initiation or admission into or affiliation with, or as a condition for continued membership in an organization operating under the sanction of, or recognized, registered, or identified by the university, including, without limitation, fraternities and sororities organization, quote. For purposes of these regulations, any activity as described herein upon which the initiation or admission into or affiliation with or continued membership in an organization is directly or indirectly conditioned, regardless of whether that organization is recognized by or registered with the university, shall be presumed to be forced activity, the willingness of an individual to participate in such an activity notwithstanding.
Thank you, Sadie.
was
You
a lot.
get a gold star today for sure.
Right.
So these are like the longest sentences known to man. But if you look at this, right, a couple of things stick out to me, right? One, at Penn, it does not matter what kind of group you are in, if it is a group that is, you know, official with the university or an underground organization or, you know, like it doesn't matter. If you are a Penn student and you are together with other Penn students, this is going to apply to you. The other thing that I think is important and is slightly different than what we saw in the hazingprevention.org definition is this idea that when it talks sort of number one, an activity or situation which recklessly or intentionally endangers, my kids are trying to get out, the mental health or physical safety of folks, right? So the recklessly piece is interesting because that could be an unintentional impact, right? You know, we were doing something and had no idea that this person had, you know, prior to showing up already had certain kinds of medication, right? Or hadn't slept at all. And then they drove somewhere for our group as part of a new member thing that we asked them to do, right? Like maybe there are groups that do scavenger hunts. I know we do less driving around because we're an urban campus, but you hear stories sometimes, right? Where like kids from Delaware State sent a kid to go get cheesesteaks from Philadelphia, right? And unfortunately, he had been up all night the night before and was in an accident, right? And so that was considered hazing. So I bring these things up just to show that like our definition is very broad, and you will also see this idea of the willingness does not matter. And it doesn't matter about trying to be a new person in a group. It's about maintaining an affiliation, right? Like, or a continued membership. So it's a very broad policy. We'll head on to the next slide. So I always think that this is, and this may be where I have a lot more to talk about, and we may end up in this area the whole time. That's fine. Because a lot of times when I talk to folks about hazing, right, if you were to think about something in your mind's eye right now that you consider hazing, right, if you just think about something either that you've experienced or that you've heard of, right, at Penn or elsewhere, my guess is a lot of the things either fall into this violent category, right, these physical or serious emotional harms, or maybe even the harassment category, right, causing emotional anguish or undue stress. We acknowledge hazing really exists. It happens on a continuum, right? I hear students sometimes talk about light hazing, right, or like baby hazing, right, as opposed to things that they imagine are more intense or you know, obviously more dangerous for people. But there are definitely, like we acknowledge there are different levels of hazing, and my analogy I always use is Speeding is speeding. Sometimes you go 5 miles over the speed limit, sometimes you go 30 miles over the speed limit. The punishment, right, if you get caught going 5 miles over may be very different than the punishment if you're going 30 miles over, right? But it doesn't mean you weren't technically speeding, right? And so that's the lens that I kind of try to put on when we talk about hazing, right? Subtle, I think they emphasize that power imbalance we talked about, or they're often downplayed, like Jamie talked about, as sort of harmless. Hey, this is just fun. It's not a big deal. And I'm not going to read this list to you, but you can sort of see the kinds of things that that we would maybe put in that subtle category. Harassment is actually where, you know, things start to, maybe this is the verbal abuse piece, and I think sometimes this language can feel strong to people, right? Like, verbal abuse doesn't sound like what we were doing, right? Were we making fun of folks when they like messed up on answering questions, right? Or being like, ah, right? But very technically, by the language of the law, right? Something like that could be put in, right, the verbal abuse category. Demanding personal services, right? We hear all the times from professors who have students who interrupt their lectures, right, because they're delivering coffee to somebody, right, the Starbucks run for someone, or they come in and sing something, or someone who has to go and get food late night for older members, right? And then violent, I think, is definitely, like, I don't think that needs explaining as you look at it, right, and you see some of those things. The reason we care about making these distinctions is hazing rarely starts out in the violent category for a group, right? Like, usually the first thing your group creates as a new tradition isn't like a, you know, a huge major abuse of a person or asking someone to do something very illegal. Typically things start out small, right? And over the years we sort of add another element that makes it a little more challenging, or there's a personality maybe in charge of that tradition who goes a bit unchecked, and it gets a little bit tougher, right, and gets a little more dangerous, and eventually then it ends up in this violent category. So the reason we care, right, is because as long as we have things that exist in this violent lane, right, on campus, it makes it really easy then to look at everything else by comparison and say, oh, it's not so bad, right? This is nothing compared to what I had to do to get into my fraternity, or what I had to do, right, as part of an athletic team. But it doesn't mean it isn't hazing, and it doesn't mean that it doesn't position itself to move up the ladder at all, right? Before I move on from this, I just want to check, like, in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, is there anything here that people find surprising, that you are like, I do not agree with this, or I do not understand why this is categorized in this way? My goal, obviously, is that we are able to get to a place where we can sort of articulate similar understandings of this. So it's important to me that, like, this makes sense a little bit, right? So I'm gonna stop talking for a second and see. You can drop in the chat or unmute yourself, like, you know, this totally aligns with what you've always understood, or, you know, there's some stuff you're either having a challenge understanding or you downright disagree with, or, you know, or just giving you something to chew on. Okay, so everyone here. So here's a question, and I'm going to ask, and you can put it in the chat. Yes or no is the answer. Is subtle hazing a problem? Is it a problem? Should we care about it? Yes or no? Like, do you think it's a problem? Yes. Okay. All right, we've got a lot of yeses. Okay, great. And if you're a no, it's fine to be a no too. I did this training 3 times in the last couple of weeks, and I got a lot of, like, no's, right? Like, some of these things are totally fine, right? So one of the things that I will say, just to keep in mind, is that it gets challenging because, like stress, sometimes hazing can have positive outcomes, right? Like, look, I'm not going to say that there aren't certain activities that groups do together that, look, I do some sort of, you know, forced activity, whatever. It actually ended up being really funny. I did bond with people. We have this great story to tell forever. Nothing happened. it was fine, right? Like, so what's the big deal? So, I mean, we definitely, like, I understand that sometimes hazing can have like the intended outcome, right? Even if we didn't call it hazing, but the activity has the intended outcome. The thing is that we have to remember is that, again, if you have a culture in a group where people don't look at things with this lens of what are we trying to achieve and what is the most respectful and sort of space that is centering people's wellness the most, right? And then build your event that way, as opposed to, well, we've always done this thing and I had a really good experience. I don't know if other people did or not, right? But like for me, it was great. And so let's keep doing it because no one's ever been hurt, right? Like that's not always the great approach that we want. Let's move on to the next slide and we'll see if anything else comes up here for folks. And you know what, I'm looking at the time, so I wanna be mindful. I'm not gonna show this video right now, but if you go to the OSA website, and Megan very kindly let us know that the link wasn't working before, but I have it, it's all updated now. You can watch this video. You may spy some members of your own performing arts community, or some of them may have graduated by now. But this is a video that we made that all Penn students are featured in. Students wrote it. It happens on campus. And it really, I think, lends itself to this idea of small things can really add up to big things because of the fact that we discount them and say, right, like this is nothing compared to what so-and-so is doing, so it's not a big deal. But then again, that always allows our worst thing to set the pace in our campus community instead of saying, we don't tolerate this kind of behavior at all, right? So I'm going to move on past that just so we can get to the next piece, but you can find that on our site, or if, I don't know if we're sharing these presentations after, I'm happy to do so. You can always watch it there. So really quickly, I want to talk about wellness because I can't remember a year since I have worked at Penn that wellness hasn't been a conversation, and particularly a very impassioned point from students, right? And very rightly so, about what are we doing at Penn to support people's wellness, right? And I would say that hazing activities do not support wellness, right? They run very counterintuitive to that. And they are often things that people, you know, these are bonding moments. These are important to people. These are our traditions from our group. And so it's an interesting thing. It's a thing we can say, hazing does not support your wellness. And in the same breath, people will say, but we cannot change the things we do because they're traditions for our group, right? They're very important. If we're the ones to change it, alumni would get mad, or no one's ever been hurt. It's not a big deal, right? Let's just keep doing it. What I would push back on and would like people to think about, right, again, whether in this group or other organizations you're a part of, or things you think of as a community, are hazing activities are really things that happen outside of like the purview of administrators, right? They don't usually happen publicly, though we may be able to point to some things that have, and I'm happy to talk about those if we want to, but we certainly try to address those. But a lot of times this stuff happens at night, at homes, or in basements, right? It could even be downtown at BYOs that get a little crazy, right? Like, so these are things that, and I don't say this to say students are to blame for this. What I am trying to say is students are really empowered to change this aspect of our campus, right? Like, you all really have the power on this one. We can provide the education, we can provide the tools for reporting, we can provide the ability to sanction and find people responsible so that people who are influenced by the idea of punishment, you know, keeping them from doing things so that that impacts them. But that doesn't really change our culture, right? And so students who say, I really care about the wellness of others, and I really care about the wellness of the people in my group. And we're seeing that right now, right? I mean, coronavirus, goodness gracious, from a very physical standpoint and also from a mental piece, right? Wellness is a major concern. So we often think about too, right? Like, hazing really only affects the people being hazed, right? Like, they're the ones affected. And you can see the different ways, you know, beyond just someone gets physically injured. A lot of times people aren't getting the sleep that they should get because of hazing activity. So then they get that nagging cough they can't seem to shake. I'm sure some of you can think back to semesters where you kind of just felt under the weather for a lot of the semester or many weeks in a row because maybe you weren't sleeping as well or eating as well because of ways that you were, you know, busy all over campus. That's the same thing that happens when people are involved in activities that are, you know, that are related to hazing, asking them to be at places at certain times and, you know, and maybe be available at hours when they would normally be trying to sleep or study, right? Declines in coursework. I can't tell you how often hazing gets on our radar because a professor writes about a concern about a student, right? Like, I had the student a previous semester, their grades are crazy. They mentioned to me that they were joining XYZ group. This might be a concern, right? But the thing that I think doesn't get played out often for folks and is really important is this right side of the effects of hazing on those who are doing the hazing. I usually say, like, if people are asked to report somewhere at a certain time, there's usually an older member or a group of older members who have to be there, right? So you're also, there's the time that gets lost in there. The other thing is that if it is something that were to become a case in the university or becomes public, certainly for people who are then involved in those cases, the potential media scrutiny or just the shame or the guilt that comes from it, right, from people knowing this activity or having this label put on it, right? Like, we know that hazing is it's a negative word, right? It has a lot of negative connotations. And so that obviously impacts the wellness of folks, right, who are then embroiled in situations where that is then, you know, kind of put out there publicly. I do see in the chat, Jaden's asking, can we only report an instance of hazing we directly experience or something we see in public, something we hear from a friend? How can we support our friends who have been affected by hazing? So for reporting, if you go on the OSA website, we have a couple of things noted. So one, you can always submit a report. Actually, very strangely, on the bias reporting form for the university, there is a check mark for hazing concerns, right? So you can put a hazing concern in there and that gets directed to my office. And typically when something comes to us that is sort of, you know, I heard this or I witnessed this or, you know, whatever, what we will do is then reach out to the group that has been and see what we can learn about the activities that we've heard about, right? Obviously, the more specificity we have in a report of any kind, the more capable we are to actually investigate it, right? A lot of times our knowledge of hazing comes through a back door, right? So a group had a number of transports from a location that seemed problematic, or a restaurant that a group was at calls the university to complain about their behavior, and then investigating that, we actually find out there's a lot more going on. You know, there could be something around interpersonal violence that happens that begins to put something on the radar, right? So a lot of times we are not hearing from people directly about concerns they have. We would love to hear those things. We get calls from parents sometimes, right, that just say, I know something's supposed to be happening, you know, my child is in X group, something's supposed to be happening at a fraternity house off campus in their basement tonight. I can't tell you more. And that's it. And I think that makes the parent feel like I've notified the university. From our end, okay, a fraternity basement, we have like 48 of them, right? And, you know, X group, it's sometime tonight. That leaves us to what, knock on the doors of every group at some point in the night and see if we happen upon it. That doesn't mean we don't do anything, right? There may be a message that goes up to group, say, if you're planning to let an external group use your basement tonight, that would not be a good idea, right? Because we got this report that there is a possible hazing concern happening. Or if they say XYZ group was going to use it, we would reach out to that group and say, hey, we got this concern. We'd love to have you come in, and we expect that you're not going to be doing any activities tonight. So there's a lot of ways we can try to catch things before they happen, but we're really only as good as the information we have. just a couple of notes. So there's the formal report, you know, that you can put a report in through student conduct if you're like, this is something I experienced or happens in my group and I think is a problem and I want to, you know, and there should be a conduct consequence. You could come to my office or in partnership with the team at Platt, right? You could say, maybe you don't want to say, hey, here's what we've done in the past, but you say, we would like to think of new member traditions. What we've done in the past may just not be great, right? We don't think it meets the actual outcomes we really wanted to have. We would really love to think about new ways to welcome our new members or maintain memberships, right? And we can sit down and come up with a new plan there, right? You don't have to, that's still a way to address a culture or a concern in a group without necessarily having to go down the path of adjudication. And then if there's a sort of, hey, I heard something, you can always send a note of what you know to myself, to Lori, to Megan, to James, right? To any number of folks, to Amanda, like to any number of trusted, you know, administrators. And when we follow up on stuff, I would never be like, Megan Edelman sent us an email, X group, and we need to know what's going on. Like, we bend over backwards to make sure that people, there's no way that someone would be able to tell who gave us any input, right? We're actually very skilled at that. Especially if it moves into an actual investigation. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Megan, thank you for dropping that link to the page. I realize we only have a few minutes left, so I want to zoom on to the next slide if that is cool. Okay, so this activity sometimes takes a while, and I'm trying to think about how we do this a little more quickly. In the chat, really quickly, I would love, because here's the deal. You can't fix a thing if you don't know why it happened, right? So first thing I want you to think is if you look at the first bullet point, imagine you were sick. And I realize that may not be hard to do right now in a world where all we do is talk about people being ill and your symptoms. But what would you consider a symptom of being sick generally? Just go ahead and drop it in the chat and I'll ask folks to sort of do it quickly since we're running shorter on time. What's the symptom? Sneezing. Could be a symptom, a headache, a sore throat, coughing, great. So great, okay, so those are all, yeah, fatigue, awesome. So you see that, Jinx, that's great. So you see, okay, I have a headache, right? So what could the apparent cause be, right? So I have a headache, the first thing I think is X, it could be this. Go ahead and drop in some ideas. Dehydrated, great. Okay, so you're dehydrated, that's why I have a headache. Sleep deprived, great. A migraine, right? So you have all of these ideas, right? So I might sit there and say, gosh, I've really got a headache, right? I could be dehydrated because I haven't had enough water. Or I had a pretty crazy night last night and I'm feeling a little hungover, right? That's related to your dehydration, right? Or yeah, I haven't been sleeping well, right? Or whatever, right? So those may be the reasons. Root cause, right? So these are my guesses at what I think it could be. Maybe I'll try a few things to fix it, right? But then maybe you decide to go to the doctor, right? What could some of the root causes be? I actually think like migraine might fall into that, right? Maybe you're prone to migraines, right? That might actually be a root cause for you. Can you think of any other things that could be a root cause for headaches? So maybe you've been concussed, right? Or something, right? Like, oh, right, I fell that one night and so now I'm getting headaches, right? Or maybe you have an eyeglass prescription, right? That is not great anymore, especially for how much time you're spending on your computer screen, right? So if my issue is that I actually am diagnosed with having migraines, but I never go to the doctor to find that out, and I think my issue is just dehydration, and I keep drinking water, that's still probably not going to fix it, right? I will probably still have headaches. So we go through this exercise, right, of you have a lot of symptoms, you could attribute it to any number of things, but usually then when you really investigate it, there's one specific cause, right? So if we do this exercise, and it's a little more challenging, right, but around hazing. What do you think some symptoms of hazing look like? Go ahead and drop those things in the chat. If you were thinking about what are the sort of outward things that people would sort of show that you might be able to just and say, ooh, that might be hazing. Irritability, bruising, anxiousness, being depressed. Okay. I could say, I mean, this may sound silly, but it's a thing, right? Like dressing ridiculously, right? That could be one. We see certain things pop out on campus every spring that make people kind of look ridiculous. And we assume, oh, that's probably a hazing activity. Any other things that you would say is sort of a symptom? These are great, the things you put in there. So if we go, apparent cause, right? So what do you think sort of that mid-level? Okay, there could be a bunch of explanations, right, for this piece. So what are maybe some of the apparent causes of hazing? This is always a little trickier for folks. Okay, so what pain could be, right? So what I would say, so it's a hard to phrase, but so an apparent cause could be this idea of like other groups do it, right? Or it's a tradition, or yeah, there could be a specific leader in the organization, right? So this idea that, maybe relative to others, this is nothing. Or an apparent cause for hazing could be like, I heard about this happening in another group and my roommate thought it was a lot of fun. And so maybe that's something we could bring to the group, right? So some of the reasons why we haze, some of the causes for hazing, right? That idea that it's a tradition could be an apparent, or an apparent cause. The idea that, sometimes people talk about folks really need to earn their spot. I see bonding, retention, right? Those are all things that we would actually put in the apparent cause column. So the thing that gets even harder then is, so what is the root cause? I mean, sometimes the apparent cause may be the root cause, right? In the issue of the sickness thing. I have a headache. I think it could be dehydration. It in fact was dehydration, right? I was right. But what if you really dug deeper? What do you think some of the other things might be that we would consider a root cause to hazing? Power, or okay, new member initiation, a toxic group culture, right? So part of what comes up to, the culture surrounding it. So what comes up sometimes, right, is that like, in fact, maybe we never took time to clarify expectations in the group for people, right? About like what they should expect when they join. You should expect to be respected. You should expect to feel comfortable. You should accept, right? Like you should expect that we are actually not going to haze you. And that sounds silly, but like I always use this example. Like I remember when I joined my sorority in college, I was like, so when's the night we get locked in a room and have to drink ourselves out of it, right? Like I expected that to happen. And my group had to be like, oh yeah, we don't do that. It's not a thing we do, Katie, right? Was I a little disappointed? Yeah, because I'd seen it in movies and it seemed really fun. But ultimately, was that a better, safer approach? Yeah. Did I still feel connected to my group? Yes. The other thing, so sometimes we just don't say, we don't do these things, right? And set that as an expectation, which then trickles down to this idea that sometimes, and when you think about the toxic culture, sometimes we don't have a culture in a group where people would feel comfortable bringing up concerns, right? Hey, I know this is the thing we've always done, but like, I'm a little worried about how this plays out or how it could make people feel. Or like, is it just the best way to do this, right? Is this our best way to bond? Could we do better? Sometimes there's a very strong sense of these are the group who's in power, right? I love this, yeah, connection, creating intimate relationships, right? A root cause, that is usually what people are really, they're looking for deep and meaningful ways to connect with others and don't really know another way to do it. We do it this way because we've always done it this way, and we can't imagine how to do it differently, right? So this is important because, again, when you think back to that very first slide, and we talked about what are the things you do and what do you hope are the outcomes, right? That, again, positions you to think about, have we really been thinking about what we're trying to get out of this? And this exercise does something similar. You can't change a thing, the activities you're seeing, go if you aren't willing to really look at why do we do this? What is the root cause for why we do this activity? And I think if there's anything you take away from this, right, you may be listening to this and being like, my group is golden, we don't do any of this stuff, nothing I read on any of those lists is us, we're good to go. I'm going to challenge back actually some of the things in the chat. A lot of times scavenger hunts are considered hazing activities. A lot of times skits and performances can be viewed that way, and I realize that can be a very challenging thing for performing arts groups to hear. And I think a lot of it has to do with the context. Are only new members being asked to do it? What's the environment, right? It's one thing to say, hey, at our first rehearsal, we're going to be asking all of the new folks to work in groups together, right? To do something like you're setting expectations versus you're coming to rehearsal, we're putting you in some blindfolds, we're going to walk you to a different location, we're going to do this at night or go to someone's apartment, there's going to be a lot of alcohol. Suddenly that context changes very much, even though on its face, these are performances, right? We're a performing arts group, you know, or being asked to perform right away on Locust Walk in the middle of the day, right? You know, on demand. I would say that falls into hazing. The scavenger hunt thing can be an issue because it really depends on what you're asking people to do, but historically, they are things that have been aligned with this idea of sometimes people steal things to, like, you know, you have to get this item from this place, or you'll be asked to take pictures of certain people or things that can sometimes be problematic. Or you'll be asked to sort of do things that are humiliating or silly, right? Like just for the purposes of a video or a picture. So those can also be little landmines, right? So I think the one thing I'm asking you to take away is if you could really take a look at what do we do when new members join, right? What are our activities? And really take some time with your leadership of your group to say, why do we do this? What do we get out of this? And could we do it better, right? Or is there something else that could do it better is really what I mean, right? Not how do we do this event better, right? But is there something else that we might be able to do that's better? Let's move on to the next slide. Really quickly. And so then this question becomes, so how do we create new member welcome events that don't include hazing? You've given us this policy that's super broad and it seems to include everything under the sun, right? It's for any member in any version of a group, whether they want to do it or not, right? Like, so it feels like everything is hazing. So how do we create these new activities, right? I would love to hear, like, and open it up, and I realize you all have already been doing a long day of Zooming, and a number of you did things last evening too. But I would love to hear from some folks. What I'm not going to do is give you a website, right? And say, like, here's where you go, and here's all the stuff you can do that isn't hazing. And I'm also not going to tell you, like, just go climb a rock wall, which you could do, which is a great way to bond. And I know that's not like what a lot of people want to do, right? Or go do a ropes course. Like, those are definitely very formal ways to do team building and bonding, right? And I also realize that's probably not super realistic, and that's not really what most people are looking to do. So I would love to hear, right? Like, so we've talked through this. You've heard some of the concerns, or, you know, how do you think, what are the kinds of things, or what's an idea, what's an event that you feel like would be great, or you think that your group does that is great? And, like, let's talk about it a little bit. So this idea of respect for new members and consent, being clear they can opt out, go home, say no to anything, and it will be okay. Right. And here's what I'm also going to say, though. If we're doing activities where we're saying you don't have to do this if you don't want to, right? Look, I think it's different. I'm going to step back from that caveat. You may say, right, like this is actually a very optional rehearsal, right? This is really something that like, it's just if you want to work a little bit more on this skill or this scene or this part, right? It truly is optional. That may be one thing that isn't, right? If it's, hey, we're doing this party, you know, we're in our lineages and, you know, we sort of have this like group drink, but like, hey, if you don't want to drink, you don't have to. That I'm going to say is an area that's fraught with a lot of power dynamics. And even if you really give people a lot of opportunity to say no, if the outcomes are not good, it could still be maybe considered hazing, right? And so I think, again, context really matters a lot when you're thinking about these ideas of consent. And we gave the person an option to say no, right? Because not everyone feels like they can say no because they so desire to be a part of these groups that you're in, right? And some of you may remember what that felt like. Some of you may be like, I never really cared about that. I just, right, this was good for me. But I think the thing we always have to remember with hazing is like, our own experience is really only our experience, right? And very rarely do we have cultures and groups where people talk about later very openly, like, that thing actually was really uncomfortable for me, right? Or this actually triggered back to something that I experienced at another point in my life, or I'm on a medication for a certain thing and that's why I can't drink, right? Like a lot of times people don't want to disclose those things. And so they go along to fit in. I mean, that's something that a lot of folks in the age group that you all are in, right? Like the desires to be a part of a thing. So we see escape room could be a great activity, free food, awesome. Here's what I always say, having allies on the board could be helpful to deal with power dynamics. I think that's amazing, right? Like, so thinking about what are the resources you need in your group, right? To make it a place where people can bring up concerns at all different levels of the organization. The thing I would say about hazing activities, and I realize we're running long on time, and so I'm gonna wrap it up here, is hazing is basically taking really normal stuff we all like to do and then like making it extreme. Right? So like, I have this desire one day, and maybe you all are the community to help me do it, of like some crazy like wrestler guy jumps in and is like, that's extreme, right? That's like, it's hazing. But like, you know, we think going out for a drink is a fun way to gather, and or the hazing version is like, you're going to drink this case of beer or this bottle of champagne or this, you know, whatever, like that suddenly becomes the hazing scenario. Let's go work out together, a very normal way to bond, turns into like, we're going to do midnight runs, or we're going to do push-ups until someone gets sick, right? Or any, right? Like, or we want to do this like really fun welcome thing for them, right? But instead we're going to like blindfold them and make it a surprise and not let them know where they're going, right? And like all of those elements usually are much more for the entertainment of the people doing the hazing than for the people experiencing the activity in the moment, right? So I think that's the other lens, right? Even if you think all the rest of the stuff is garbage, or you got caught up in the root cause and apparent cause thing and that confused you, I always think like, what's the thing we're doing? And is this like the normal everyday version of it, or have we like kind of put that extreme lens on it, right? Have we kind of gone over the top with this? And that may be a great way of like helping you identify points, maybe some pain points in the group that could use some focus, right? Or could use some attention and a little bit of review. Megan, I can't remember if I have one more slide after this or not, and I may not. Okay, so we're not going to do the breakout things, but because we're at the end of time. But I think this is really important for you all to think about, and maybe a question to take with you back into your spaces. What do you or your group need in order to effectively address issues of hazing, right? So some suggestions I made, sometimes maybe it's more education, as we're seeing in the chat here, clear channels on how to voice internal concerns, an opportunity to really review your activities internally, creating space and time for that. I know there's never space and time, right? We're always working on the next show, the next program, the next thing, but like, what does it look like to set aside time for that? To ask people about their experiences, maybe anonymously, their comfort levels with things. right? Or to be able to come to an administrator and say, hey, here's something we've put together on the kinds of things we do. You know, what could we do? Yeah, stophazing.org, which Megan's put a great link to. We're actually part of a consortium. The University of Pennsylvania is part of a consortium with Stop Hazing, where we're in a 3-year study with them. You will get a hazing survey at some point in the next semester, I am hoping. All undergraduate students will, to help us learn more about hazing culture on campus. But they're a great resource for other activities and things that you might be able to do, or like rubrics to look at to help you think about how you can look at events and activities. And I love Christina's note here, this getting away from the mindset of a rite of passage or a need to earn anything. When you let a person into a group, when you say you got the part, right, or you're now a member, we need to start saying, and that means you're a member in full. There are not more things to prove, right? There are not more things to prove. You are now a member, and you are now one of us. And so we're not going to ask you to do things for our entertainment, right? Or things just to prove yourself. You did that in the process. And I can tell you, as someone who's getting responses from people about the process of trying to join groups right now, the process to try and join is hard enough. And so this idea that we create more things afterwards, right, is really challenging for folks. So I really love that. I like that there's some seconding in here of really trying to step away from that mindset. So we're at 3:15. I've taken you way over time. I really appreciate you hanging tight. If you want to follow up with me, or you have anything for Lori or Megan afterwards, you know, whatever, please let me know. Thanks so much for giving me some time on a Sunday afternoon. You all are awesome. And I look forward to a time I can actually see you people on campus.